Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed your lunch, and we thank you for sticking around. Hopefully you got out there to see the demos and the great stuff that our sponsors had that would help us all reduce our road salt applications. I am very excited right now to introduce our keynote speaker. Environmental advocacy is not a job. It is a passion. It's where you can overcome your fears of feeling uneasy, where you speak for what is right and what is true, where you speak for what you want to do and that you are willing to take a stand despite the potential ramifications. I have been very fortunate to have been associated with a special group of people and individuals for the past 20 years who represent and live these values every day. To fight and speak for their waters and for their people that rely on them for drinking supplies, for food, and for a quality of life. We are called water keepers, bay keepers, and river keepers. I respect all of them, for they are true heroes and warriors. We are fortunate to have the leader of the Waterkeeper Alliance with us today. Now, despite he's got a couple initials, a JD and LLM, I don't know what they really stand for. I got a PE, I kind of know what that stands for, but we could be working elsewhere and probably being more successful, but again, we are advocates and we are passionate. I first heard about Marc in 2002 when I became the Lake George Waterkeeper. Ironically, through reading an article that he had authored on the impacts of road salt in the Catskill watershed, the New York City water supply. At the time, Marc was a senior environmental attorney with Hudson Riverkeeper. Marc was raised on a creek in central Pennsylvania and now leads Waterkeeper Alliance as its executive director and CEO for the past 16 years. So water is a part of his life and it's a part of his soul. Like all water keepers, I am honored he was available to come, and today he will speak to us about the need to act to help the Clean Water Act, which turns 50 years old next Tuesday. Lake George has been fortunate to have received legislation to protect its exceptional waters, but too many of our waters in the U.S. and worldwide remain unprotected, despite important laws like the Clean Water Act, which we see getting eroded. Pun intended. Marc shares his passion for clean waters worldwide, as there are now over 300 water keepers in 45 countries. I'm excited to share some of the great work here at Lake George with him as a model for freshwater protection and to meet that water keeper standard. It's even more special that we fulfilled a long promise we made sometime in the past to make a Lake George visit happen, perhaps while sharing a beverage at a Waterkeeper conference and talking about another passion we share, live music. So please help me welcome a true advocate, a person who walks the walk and talks the talk, a Waterkeeper and my good friend, Marc Yaggi.
Thank you, Chris, for that kind introduction. My 11-year-old daughter told me the other day that PE stands for phys ed. So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm really grateful to be here in, let me see. Oh, wait, can you go back? Really grateful to be here in Lake George and happy to be here with all of you. As Chris mentioned, we've got water keepers all around the world, and so I'm really fortunate to get to travel all around the world to visit these water keepers and have some amazing experiences in some beautiful places. But New York is home, and it's always, for me, really the most special experience to get to be places around New York, especially places like the Adirondacks or Lake George, the queen of the American lakes. And so I feel like we're really fortunate to have such incredible natural resources right outside our back door. And I'm honored to be here today for Lake George Association Salt Summit, and really grateful to my friend Chris Nowitzki for inviting me. As Chris mentioned, I've known him for approximately 20 years, which is coincidentally as long as the Lake George Waterkeeper has been an integral part of my organization, Waterkeeper Alliance. And over the course of its 20 years of, its illustrious 20 years of existence, Lake George Waterkeeper has been out there every day working to ensure that the community has a voice in decisions that impact the community and its waterway. And I really, I admire Chris because he is this dynamic combination of engineer, water quality scientist, and advocate. And that's a potent combination that served him well on issues like septic systems and road salt reduction, as of today, and development projects. And it's really unique to bring those three skill sets together. I can say I've been working in the water and climate space for more than 20 years, and I think maybe I'll try to bring one of them to the table. That's that I'm an advocate, which will probably give you an idea of what I'm going to speak about today. I said to Chris a couple days ago, maybe we should just call it a palate cleanser, because despite the fact that I wrote an article about road salt 20-some years ago, that was like 3 generations ago to me. And I'm really going to be talking about kind of the water crisis, water issues, and not about salt. So you go to the salt in the morning, salt in the afternoon. We'll cleanse the palate with just some water right now. And the main thing I'm going to be really talking about is why. Because you all have assembled the best and brightest of people on road salt science and policy and reduction issues and matters, and had all these. I heard about the great panel earlier with all of the road warriors that are out there making change, and so you've assembled all these experts and these best and brightest folks here. So what I'm going to do is just talk about. I'm going to dial it back to something simple, which is why. Why are you doing the work that you do? Or, another way to look at it is, why is it so important that you do the work that you're doing? And I'm going to kick things off with a global to local chat about our most important natural resource, which is, of course, water. So if you think about it for just a moment, every part of our lives is affected by water. Like I said, I'll keep it simple, right? We drink it or we die. We grow our crops with it. We fish in our lakes, our rivers, our creeks, our seas. We bathe with it. We wash with it. We wouldn't have clothes without water. And we also know that people love being on, in, and around water, like Lake George. And why is that? That's because studies show that it makes us happier, it makes us healthier, it reduces stress, and it brings us peace. Many of us have powerful memories of water. Maybe it's a special beach vacation. Maybe it's learning how to swim. Maybe it's learning how to go fishing or with your mother or father. Seeing a whale breach. Lots of different experiences people have with water that make them more connected to a local waterway or any other waterway. Think about yours. Chris mentioned I grew up on a creek in Pennsylvania. So for me, my love of water began growing up in the Susquehanna River watershed in Pennsylvania. And I could walk out my back door and go for miles. And as a boy, I had a golden retriever named Ben, and Ben and I used to swim and fish every day from roughly April to October. We'd go after school, we'd go on weekends, we'd go day after sunny day. Really being on, in, and around that water was freedom and happiness. And I assumed that these types of experiences were being shared by everyone. But when I got older, learned a little bit more, traveled some, I realized that not everyone could go down to their local waterway, jump in and have a swim without fear of getting sick. And not everyone could draw a cool glass of water, drink it, without fear that they were going to be ingesting toxins. And not everyone could go down to their local lake, their river, their creek, or their pond, throw a line in, catch a fish, and bring it home to feed their family like I could without being worried that they were going to poison their family with mercury or PCBs. And, I couldn't understand how such an important resource wasn't available to everyone, or how other kids weren't able to experience something that was so second nature to me. And the situation really is more than just a matter of fairness, because it's really ultimately killing people. As it shows up there, today more than 2 billion people lack worldwide access to drinkable water. And water scarcity is affecting half the world's population. But at the same time, we're polluting what little water we have left, because every day 2 million tons of sewage, industrial, and agricultural waste are being dumped into our planet's waterways. In pre-COVID times, if we remember back then, more than half the world's hospital beds were filled with somebody with a waterborne illness. And each year, more people die from unsafe water than from all forms of violence, including war. And consider this. Every year, 3.2 million children under the age of 5 die from unsafe drinking water and poor sanitation. That's right, 3.2 million children. And, hovering over all of this is the existential crisis of climate change. And climate change is a water issue, because climate change is altering the chemistry of our oceans, the character of our coastlines, timing and intensity of rain and snow, wreaking havoc around the planet. When I talk to people all over the world when I'm traveling, and I ask them what they think about climate change, it always manifests through water. Their responses are always the same. They talk about drought, they talk about flooding, they talk about sea level rise, they talk about ocean acidification, extreme storms, and other issues like that. We see in our work, we also see the impacts of climate change through water, and we see it through the lens and the eyes of our water keepers. In Ladakh, India, our Himalayan glacier water keepers will tell you that in the past 10 years, everything's turned upside down. It doesn't snow when it should, and it rains when it shouldn't. They've had to relocate certain communities because of drought, and they've had to rebuild other communities because of excessive flooding. In Mongolia, our Tool River waterkeeper tells us about how increasing levels of drought have had forced people to move out of the countryside into cities that aren't equipped to handle the surge in population. Or here in the United States, in Seattle, our Puget Sound keeper worries about ocean acidification threatening a $270 million a year shellfish industry. And our waterkeepers in the Bahamas know that there's a good chance they might lose a majority of their land over the next century, and they worry about the security of their culture, their heritage, and their very existence. So we see how that plays out through water. And even so, with all of these threats, we still take water for granted, because we always sort of have this unconscious expectation that we're going to turn on the tap and it's going to be there when we need it. But at the same time, our species is squandering this vital, critical resource at a very rapid pace, which makes you wonder sort of like, how can we be so cavalier about the way water is misused and ill-distributed and violated? My youthful fondness of water from going back to Pennsylvania prompted me to ask, what can I do? And ultimately, that's what led me to Waterkeeper Alliance, where I got to meet and work with great people like Chris. And, our organization was incorporated in 1999, but we trace our roots back to 1966, right here in New York on the Hudson River, where a band of blue-collar recreational and commercial fishermen banded together to take the river back from the polluters and restore it to its rightful owners, which were the people of the Hudson Valley. And these fishermen, first as Hudson River Fishermen's Association and then as Hudson River Keeper, they patrolled the river, they identified pollution problems, and they used citizen action, science, and law to force those polluters to clean up the mess that they had created. And thanks to them, these fishermen, and the laws that they helped put on the books, when I'm traveling around the world, people always remark about how the Hudson River inspired them, that they see it as an icon of ecosystem revitalization because they took a dead river and restored it back to health. There's still a lot of issues and challenges on the Hudson, but today it's cleaner than it's been in more than 50 years. And today, because of their success, those fishermen's success on the Hudson, that sprouted my organization, Waterkeeper Alliance, which is now a global organization uniting more than 330 of these Waterkeeper organizations in 48 countries on 6 continents. And all of these groups combined employed more than 1,200 advocates, all modeled after that work that was created on the Hudson. In fact, we have more, and there's Fred Tutman. I was just speaking to somebody about that. That's right. In fact, we have more advocates on the water than any organization in the world. There are waterkeepers in China, India, Ireland, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Togo, Kenya, Senegal, Peru, Chile, Colombia, and beyond. I won't name all 48 countries. It would be a good quiz, though. And that, of course, includes your Lake George waterkeeper, who is out protecting that waterway, your treasured waterway, day in and day out, now and for future generations. And these are all women and men who are drawn from different languages, different cultures, different religions, and different legal and political frameworks. But they are fighting for a world where everyone can drink from their local water source without fear of ingesting toxins, where everyone can catch and cook a fish without fear of poisoning themselves, and where our children are nurtured by water and not sickened by it. So to accomplish these goals here in the United States, we have important legal tools that we can use, and particularly the Clean Water Act. So back in the 1960s, our waterways were dying. In fact, like on the screen, some of our rivers, like the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, were on fire, literally. But then in 1970, in April of 1970, 20 million Americans took to the streets to demand clean air and clean water. This was the first Earth Day, April of 1970. And that show of force from the American public prompted Congress to act. And so over the next several years, Congress passed what are today considered to be our modern federal environmental laws. The Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and so on. There's about 28 of them. And as part of that, in 1972, Congress overrode President Nixon's veto and passed the Clean Water Act, which was a federal law that was designed to reduce or eliminate pollution into our nation's waterways. The Clean Water Act has been very effective at controlling and cleaning up pollution in many respects. In 1920s Portland, Oregon, construction workers refused to work on projects next to the Willamette River because it smelled so bad. Today, the Willamette River is one of the most heavily recreated waterways in the United States. And as noted before, in the 1960s, the Hudson River was nearly dead. Today, it's an icon of ecosystem revitalization. This is some of the success of the Clean Water Act. And we use, in communities across the United States, our waterkeepers are using the Clean Water Act to accomplish their goals of protecting their community's right to clean water. So, for example, in Atlanta, Georgia, in the 1990s, our Chattahoochee Riverkeeper had a settlement with the city of Atlanta under the Clean Water Act that forced the city to upgrade and stop thousands of spills of sewage and stormwater into the Chattahoochee River because they had for decades neglected their infrastructure. The settlement ultimately ended up with the city spending $2 billion in investment into their infrastructure. And shortly after that investment was made, E. coli levels plunged by more than 80% in the Chattahoochee River. And the Chattahoochee is now a diamond or something to be proud of in the city of Atlanta, unlike when it was in the 80s. Last year in South Carolina, our Charleston waterkeeper did an investigation, and they found that plastic nurdles, or these little plastic pellets that you use to make plastic products, were pervasive throughout the Charleston Harbor, along the beaches. They used the Clean Water Act against a packaged resin packaging company, and had a historic settlement with them, which required new containment measures, which would prevent or eliminate future spills, and also landed $1 million settlement fund that would help protect the health and water quality in Charleston Harbor. And then out in California, San Diego Coastkeeper used the Clean Water Act against the city of San Diego to secure a massive wastewater recycling program where instead of discharging polluted wastewater into the ocean, Now the city is going to be recycling it back into their water supply system. It's going to be providing up to 50% of the city's water supply from recycling that wastewater. And you're talking about 83 million gallons a day in a place where water security is a significant issue out west. And of course, here in New York, the Waterkeepers had a victory with the Clean Water Act because it was a challenge to New York State's industrial stormwater permit, and the judge ruled that Class A special waters, like Lake George and Lake Placid, were categorically off limits to industrial polluters. So DC was no longer able to issue a general permit to polluters on those lakes. There are lots of Clean Water Act successes like that, but the thing is, there remains so much more work to be done. We haven't yet fulfilled the promises of the Clean Water Act. In fact, many of our waterways are still far too polluted. In some cases, the pollution's increasing. EPA's own data shows that more than 500,000 miles of rivers and streams in the United States are impaired for pollution. Their data shows that about 14 million acres of lakes and reservoirs in the United States are impaired for pollution, and about 40,000 square miles of open waters of the Great Lakes are impaired for pollution. Those numbers should be zero. So the Clean Water Act clearly needs to be strengthened. The act is turning 50 years old next week, a mere 5 days away. And it's having a midlife crisis. It's going to be 50. It needs to be updated to deal with current challenges and future challenges. So what we're using that anniversary to do is to celebrate those successes, like some of those that I mentioned, but also rally people around the need to strengthen the Clean Water Act. And so in doing that, we've got 4 key priorities. One is ensuring that there's a strong science-based definition of what is called waters of the United States that are protected from pollution under the Clean Water Act. So if a lake, a river, a creek, a stream, a wetland is not considered to be under the definition of waters of the United States, then pollution can be dumped into that waterway without any protection, without any treatment controls, contaminating drinking water sources, killing fish, and sickening children when they go swimming, that used to happen before the Clean Water Act in 1972. By way of example, the last administration redefined waters in the United States, and under that definition, approximately 93% of the waterways in the state of Arizona were no longer protected by the Clean Water Act. And the state of Arizona, by its own admission, did not have the framework or the capacity to bridge that gap. Number 2 is holding industrial agriculture accountable for their pollution. So these factory farms have replaced independent farmers in many places and resulted in massive amounts of air, land, and water pollution. And it often disproportionately impacts economically disadvantaged communities. And despite the fact that these factory farms create as much waste as a small city, they're rarely, if ever, required to put in pollution controls or to clean up the mess that they make. In fact, the largest factory farms in the United States are supposed to have Clean Water Act permits. Today, only 31% of them do. The third priority is addressing non-point source pollution, stormwater runoff, and combined sewer overflows. As I'm sure most of you know, we're here talking about road salt today. We're talking about a lot of stormwater runoff. So you all know a lot about that. It comes from myriad sources, and it's still one of the largest yet to be fully addressed pieces of the Clean Water Act. It's a lot about what you're talking today, and of course, road salt falls into this category, and the work you're all doing is really inspiring and amazing. With municipalities around here achieving 50% reductions. I think Chris told me before this, getting closer to 70% reduction, saving tens of thousands of dollars of taxpayers' money. And that's a prime example of what can be achieved when parties come together and work together on science-based solutions. That's not happening else in a lot of other places. So we really want to take the great work you all are doing here and be able to replicate that in other locations. In many places, the waterways are still being choked with road salt and other types of runoff with litter and grease and oil and more. And really to correct a lot of the failures that we have in not implementing this provision of the Clean Water Act is we've really also got to make sure that we prioritize this new infrastructure funding to assist communities in controlling water pollution from non-point sources, and making sure there's good promotion of green infrastructure as well. The fourth priority it involves things that you can't see. So, due to the work of so many different stakeholders and advocates, a lot of the waterways you don't see, they're not on fire anymore. In many places you don't see as much trash. People have worked really hard to get their way. A lot of them are cleaner than they were. But what we need to be concerned about is things that you can't see. These invisible pollutants that are getting into our waterways that you're not able to see, like trash or fire or other ones. These are things that are getting into our drinking water. They're getting into the waterways that we use for recreation. Some of these are called emerging contaminants. That's because they're not regularly monitored and they're not regulated. And one example I'm going to just talk about briefly are called PFAS or PFAS, which is per and polyfluoroalkyl alkyl substances. Some of you may know or be familiar with them, but if not, these are a class of more than 9,000 toxic chemicals that were created by accident in the 1930s by chemists at DuPont and 3M. They were doing a chemical reaction, and at the end of it, there remained a thin film in the chamber that they hadn't expected, and it fought off every attempt they had to try to break the atoms apart. It turned out that this discovery they had turned out to be quite useful because they found out that it repels water, it repels oil, and it repels grease. So today, we've got PFAS that we're using in many forms. It's in our nonstick cookware. It's in microwave popcorn bags. It's in pizza boxes, burger wrappers, carpets, water-resistant jackets, in some cases dental floss and shampoo as well. And these PFAS are water-soluble, so they're in our water now. They're in our fish. And for probably all of us in this room, they're in our blood. The problem is that science is increasingly linking these chemicals to different types of cancer, liver and kidney problems, immunological problems, and reproductive and developmental harm. So this summer, we conducted a first-of-its-kind nationwide sampling survey of surface waters for PFAS. Working across the United States, we took 228 samples at 114 sites, so an upstream sample and a downstream sample. We got the lab results a few weeks ago and have compiled them into a report that we're going to release next Tuesday on the anniversary of the Clean Water Act. So I can't give away too much at this point, but I can say that we, in 83% of the samples we took around the country, from Alaska down to Miami, 83% of the samples detected PFAS, typically more than one type. We tested for 55 different types of PFAS. We found 35 of them, and typically more than one in each one of those samples. And to give you a little bit of the idea of the magnitude, in a waterway in Pennsylvania, my home state, in fact, in my home watershed, not quite close to where I grew up, but in my home watershed, there was a sample of PFOA, which is a very common type of those 9,000 PFAS. It's what we use in nonstick cookware. The level that was found was more than 211,000 times EPA's health advisory limit, the lifetime health advisory limit that EPA has, which is 0.004 parts per trillion. Right? If anybody work in water science and sampling, you probably don't deal with parts per trillion very often. I mean, maybe parts per million, parts per billion, but parts per trillion is next to zero. I mean, 0.004 parts per trillion is 4 quadrillion. So it was found to be more than 211,000 times what EPA says is an acceptable level, healthy level for you to have over a lifetime of drinking water. So EPA is in the process right now of developing national drinking water standards for PFAS. They're going to be releasing a draft this fall with a plan to finalize them by next fall. So utilities are going to have to be preparing for these regulations, going to have to be sampling the waterways, looking at fate and transport, preparing to deploy technological solutions, among other things. The irony, though, is that ratepayers will be paying utilities to get PFAS out of our drinking water, which is good. We don't want it in our drinking water. But the irony or the unfairness is that there are no federal limits, no limits on how much can be discharged by the industries that are using PFAS. So they're dumping it into our drinking water, and then we're paying to get it taken out. So we're subsidizing that pollution is what's going to happen. And it's a massive issue because there are an estimated 42,000 industrial dischargers of PFAS in the United States, including a dozen or so just down the road in Glens Falls. However, the lack of effluent limits on industry may change, as there is federal legislation right now that would require EPA to develop water quality criteria and effluent limits on PFAS dischargers like metal finishing companies, electroplaters, paint formulators, textile mills, leather tanners, and so on. So the Clean Water Act's led to a lot of great success stories, but the job isn't done. We have a lot of work to do to make all of our waterways safe and clean, and it takes all of us to be part of the solution. At the end of the day, apathy and non-involvement are really the biggest barriers to meaningful progress and positive change. And so if you care about the future, being a bystander is not an option. And we all have our reasons why to be part of the solution. I always like to encourage people to think about why. Why do they want to be part of the solution? Why do they want to get engaged? Why is clean water important to you? Think about what it means to you. I haven't been up to this community in a bunch of years, but I still can recall, and I saw it as I was coming in, just the incredible beauty of the communities, the waterway, the natural resources you have here. It's a place that it nurtures your soul. It gives you a measure of peace. It brings you happiness. And a place that I know you won't stand by and watch be destroyed. So, there's something out there that compels you to do the work that you do. And to get to the heart of these matters, sometimes it just requires you to look inward and think about it from a personal perspective. I know I do. I've got an 11-year-old son and a 14-year-old son and an 11-year-old daughter. And they both mean the world to me. And I don't want to look back in 20 years and wonder if I could have done more to give them a healthy and sustainable future. Because I want to see them have a future that involves clean air and clean water and clean energy and good jobs and equality and a strong economy. I don't want them to look back at their parents' generation with bewilderment and contempt and ask, how could we have left them a world where we've got dirty rivers and dying oceans and denuded forests and sterile fields? We owe it to these future generations to leave them a better world than what we inherited. Not a world where people don't have enough water to drink or where it's not safe to drink the water because it poisons them. And, the road to fulfilling the Clean Water Act's promise to make sure we do have clean water is a long road. We've got many more miles to go. I say, 1968 in Washington, D.C., Martin Luther King Jr. said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And former President Obama used that quote in a commencement address at Rutgers University a few years back. And he said he agreed with that quote, but he didn't feel like the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice or freedom or equality on its own, but rather it depends on us and the choices we make at certain inflection points in history. And that we all need to be change agents that are going to help bend that arc towards creating a world where clean water is a reality and a given for all. And I know that you all have come together here as change agents in the work that you're doing in this road salt reduction program, other projects you're doing to protect Lake George and other communities that you're from, and to preserve these critical community assets. And it requires change makers like you and remembering why you do it and inspiring yourself to keep moving forward. And so I'm just really grateful to be able to be here today and learn more about everything that you're achieving and the challenges that you have and how you're overcoming them. And really grateful to be here, Chris, and thank you all so much for having me today.
Thank you, Mark. Are there any questions? And I completely agree. Mark was afraid that what he was saying couldn't relate to, the road salt, and how could he? But clearly what he touched on, changing and how we change our mindset and how we approach problems, how we use science, which we're using here, and how we really look and change and protect this for our children in the future. So clearly it's relevant, and I want to thank Marc for that. Are there any questions that people have over there?
Yeah, Marc, thank you very much for a very interesting program. And I have one question for you. You started at the beginning and you were mentioning something about Lake Placid and Lake George and something about DEC. Could you just restate what you were saying about that?
Yeah, so under the Clean Water Act, there are stormwater permits that can be issued, and there are different categories. Some are municipal stormwater permits, some are industrial category permits, and a lot of times they'll do an issue like a general permit, which kind of covers a broad portion of the industry. And we had to challenge a DEC decision, a DEC issuance of an industrial stormwater permit, because it would allow industrial discharges into Class AA special waters like Lake George and Lake Placid. And so the judge wrote that those are categorically, waterways like Lake George and Lake Placid were categorically off limits from industrial pollution.
Yes, Marc, thank you for your presentation. Speaking of permits, there are groups of environmentalists who would criticize these environmental laws as merely becoming permitting systems to allow pollution of the resources they were designed to protect. How do you respond to that criticism?
Well, I don't disagree. I think that they're right. You know, in fact, the goal of the Clean Water Act was to eliminate pollution into our waterways by 1985. We're way beyond that. It's the framework we have. I mean, you know, it's hard to get anything. If you're talking about the federal level, look how difficult it is to get anything through. I think there are a lot of tools. I think the Clean Water Act provides a good framework. It provides a lot of tools. The problem is it's not implemented and it's not enforced. So you'll see a lot of change when it's implemented and it's enforced. And that's where people like Chris come in to enforce the Clean Water Act, because it's not always being done by the state or by the feds. But I agree that we could have a much more ideal solution too.
Hi, my name is Carol Collins, and I hired Chris Nowitzki 20 years ago, and I think he's going to last. He's done a wonderful job here today. Speaking of these narratives, such as the Clean Water Act, we have something called AA Special here in Lake George, and of course it's a narrative that protects the lake, but it's having a more difficult time as the development goes on in the basin. And I think the Waterkeeper Alliance has touched upon this, but the narrative at some point needs to become standards, water quality standards, which we seem to be lacking, and it's holding back some of the protection measures we need. We're working on trying to get those standards now, but it's been a difficult path. And I'm wondering, have you had success across the nation in working on those, especially for a legal mesotrophic lake like Lake George?
Yeah, no, you're right. That I didn't touch on that in the priorities of the Clean Water Act, but in the specifically around like the industrial agriculture space, there's a lack of I think you're probably talking about numerical standards, right? In a lot of cases, there are narrative standards, of sort of like the water shouldn't look muddy or whatever the different narrative standard might be. You're right. The numerical standards are the ones that really are the ones that we need to have. Gives you an objective response as to whether there's pollution going into that waterway, but there's a reluctance sometimes. There's certainly a reluctance from those that are discharging to want to have numerical standards, and it's really hard to get it through EPA and stuff sometimes. That is part of the priorities that we have under the Clean Water Act, absolutely. It's like you say, though, it's a tough road, for sure, and good choice.
Any other questions for Mark?
So I just want to thank you, Mark, again. It was inspiring. It was eye-opening. But nothing we don't already sense or have some awareness of. And one of the big questions I have is, how do we're demonstrating it here at Lake George. We are getting people aboard across the aisle and across sectors. So we have the business community stepping up. The host of this event is participating in our road salt reduction initiative at Fort William Henry. And it seems to me, unless we do the same, and I know how hard this is, I understand where you're at and the Waterkeeper Alliance's role as an advocate. But if we can't build those bridges in real terms, and if we can't lead with that economic case, because that's what we're doing here. As goes Lake George, the health of Lake George, so goes that lake-based economy. We lose the lake, we lose everything this region stands for. You said it when you started, this is the queen of American lakes. This is one of the clearest, cleanest lakes in the world, close to major population centers. Businesses take note, not just tourism businesses, all businesses. So how do we bring the business, sorry to make a speech here, but how do we, but it moves the dial, nothing talks. I mean, let's face it, the strongest lobby we have, whether it's in DC or Albany or anywhere, is the business lobby. How do we bring them to the table in a meaningful way that gives them a seat not as an adversary, but as an ally? Because it seems to me until we can do that, we're going to be continuing to, pardon the pun, but to swim upstream.
Yeah, no, 100%. And what I didn't say earlier was, especially talking about the sort of the history of Hudson Riverkeeper and the start of Waterkeeper Alliance, is that our whole fundamental approach from our philosophy is that change happens at the local level. And that's where you're going to see progress. It's not a top-down imposition. It's where you can come together and bring joint solutions together. It's easier to hold local officials accountable. And, that's where I always use the example when I'm out in other places of talking about how change happens at the local level. It's a simple example, but it's an easy one. It's just that the state of New York, the governor and the legislature didn't decide to ban plastic bags. It happened because communities realized that there was a big plastic problem. And so they organized and they got together and they talked with their local grocers and different and they all came together and they developed something that worked in their community. And then the next community took it and replicated it. And the next community took it and replicated it, and it bubbled up to the state. It's all about local making change. And the most effective local is when you can bring together different parties and business. We work with a number of businesses on things, and I didn't mention in the PFAS thing is there's a lot of businesses now that are getting out of that and making sure they're not using it in their products. Starbucks is eliminating it from all their packaging. Patagonia is getting out of their waterproof jackets. Gore-Tex is getting out of their jackets. They can be really powerful partners in pushing towards that solution. For sure. Good.
Anyone else?
Thanks, brother.
Thank you. Oh, one more. Just when you thought.
Yep.
Thank you, Mark. One, I might have missed if it was said. Is this going to be available for anybody online after 3 o'clock today? Not immediately, but in the future?
Yes, we are taping this. We are streaming it online, obviously, but we will have videos of all the clips, all the presentations at the Lake George Association.org website. I'm sure we'll send an email out to all attendees so they'll be aware of it. So yes, it will be.
Cool. And, Mark or Chris, I'm going to ask for something. Chris, I've called you a couple of times in the last year since I was here, and what I'm going to ask for, if it exists, just please interrupt me. And what I'm asking is, I really appreciated the bucket demonstration. I love simplicity, and what I'm looking for, and maybe it does exist, but I'm looking for, like right here, I was here last year, I just mentioned, for me, it's like, I'm not a scientist, it's like drinking from a fire hose. I went to our town. I asked about brine. It wasn't time yet. Thank God we're being surrounded by towns. I'm sitting near guys who are doing it, surrounded by towns that are doing brine. So it's probably just inevitable. But I can't help but think that even if it comes to our town by way of whatever reason, that what I'm hoping for either exists or could be created is the elevator pitch that a guy like me who's not a scientist can go in, and I went in and I said there's great stuff happening and I did my best. But if there was just an elevator pitch, either written ideally, just bullet points going down, that anybody anywhere on the planet for that matter can lay out to those who are still in the shade, if not the dark. I can't help but think it'd be immensely invaluable. And I'll finish with the one thing you did say to me, Chris, about 6 weeks ago. You mentioned you weren't sure, I believe, that if this elevator pitch did exist, but you threw out one number, and I went back with it. And if I got it correct, if I remember correctly, you said there was a 5-year ROI, return on investment. And that was the one thing that I came back with, and I got attention right away. And I'm thinking if there were 5 or 10 or whatever of those talking points, I think it would be invaluable.
Well, thanks. I'm glad it's a number that I can actually back up, and I didn't, just make up on the fly. So, sorry. No, but that's the one. No, we found that, when we were investing and working with these towns, that's what it was. The investment, the grants that we provided, and I think if you want that elevator pitch, if you're on a long elevator ride, you should bring like Tim from Town of Hague, because he'll give you all the pitch that you need. But we can work on that. I think, the ROI is Eric talked about earlier. It's the economics and it's the environmental side. When we started working with the operators and letting them know about the science, we know that it's a fire hose. That's why we kind of brought in McKaylee to bring in the wool, to kind of, not to pull wool over your eyes, but to kind of lighten the thing up a little bit. But I think, when we talk about the economics, when we talk about the importance of the environment and talk about fishing and how, and I'm focusing on road salt right now. I don't know about the elevator pitch for PFAS or anything else, but, we can work on that. That's where I think, so if we can get, 3 or 4 important points like that, but, I would show them, it's longer than an elevator pitch, but I would show them, this link for that presentation with the buckets. And I think that'll go far.
That's why my opening question was about the possibility of seeing this. So
Absolutely. That will be up, and all attendees will receive that link once it's up on the website. All right, great, thanks. Thank you very much, Mark. Really appreciate it.